So welcome everybody also. Oh, didn't go to the next slide. One moment. There we go. And naturally, O'Reilly's hosting this presentation because I wrote this book on them. And I'm doing it to help promote the book, but also because as thick as it is, over 500 pages, I've had more stuff to say even than that. One of the things that comes up a lot, and which I spend a lot of time doing when I start a new job or work with a new client, is to talk about process, implementation strategies, and communicating with developers. Though I'm very obviously a UX guy right now, if I have to give myself a title, I prefer interaction designer, or, of course, ideally mobile interaction designer, though much of this is rather generic for any type of development, so you can challenge me in your questions if you find specific questions about mobile that I'm not addressing, you feel. But in the past, I've also been a web developer, and I've even been a DBA of sorts. I've managed teams of technical people in corporate IT organizations. I've been trained in about a dozen different development processes and completed over 150 Agile projects. So I hope that I kind of know what I'm talking about for this. Aside from collaboration and working with developers, I understand the pressures and needs from both sides of the equation. Partly for that, and partly as I know many of you are developers looking to improve the design of your products, this presentation and actually a lot of the book is actually targeted not just to designers, but both designers and developers. Let's start with the typical current state of the world, or the opinions you encounter a lot of times. I'll avoid naming names, though I'm sure you could Google it and find the thing, but the sentiments are all too commonly expressed. This is just a real quote from a real UX that essentially says, developers ruin everything. Pretty things are always hard to implement, not due to incompetence, not even because developers maliciously try to get in our way, but due to the fundamental nature of the universe. And this one, from the developer point of view, sadly cut down because it wasn't a nice Twitter feed, but from an interview, is the same basic point, that there are two threads going on here. They design for themselves, not for any class of end user at all, and along with that, that they reject the entire principle of UX design, that last word, opinions. There's a perception, especially among developers, that UX is an art, and art is opinion, so whoever yells loudest or digs their heels in the most wins. So don't let those UX guys pull anything over on you. If you have the power, don't even let them in the building. And these are a little overstated, but they are, I think, things I've actually encountered. Naturally, it's all non-productive talk, and we need to get over that and work together. The gist of much of my talking about process, and especially of UX in strict development processes like Agile, is that we as UX designers are expected to not work with the process, but to become part of it, and to adapt ourselves to the other process. The end result being that all our processes are discarded themselves when not obviously understandable. But that doesn't really do anyone any good. It's not just bad for our careers as UX designers trying to do our jobs, but bad for the product and the business, because we're actually all closer to each other than you'd think in principle. And by taking a bit of time to analyze and mesh the processes, no one has to end up outside their comfort zone. But it does take time to analyze. You need to not just believe that others have value, but be able to explain to others and yourself what you contribute to the effort. There are many gaps in processes where a miracle occurs, like that old cartoon, and details are simply not nailed down. If you do a serious analysis of process, you'll often find that you or someone else is assumed to just do stuff. No one knows how, and often no one knows why they're supposed to do that either. Very often this is because the process is trying to stretch itself too far, and another process can fill in the gaps. There are a lot of these, but my biggest example is in creating features, or if you're in Agile mode, stories, if you wish, within most development processes. Up here on the wall, where did all these cards come from? how do we know these are useful or the most important ones are being done first? I have myself come weeks into an implementation of some project at that last-minute regrettable mode to fix some minor issue and discovered on investigation that as many as half the features are duplicates or conflicts. And that's simply because development is not really about the creation of these ideas from a business point of view. It's totally fine, and we support their lifestyle decision, but others can help. UX, for example, has a good analytical techniques to find problems, understand user and business needs, and develop things which are impossibly similar to feature lists or stories when you actually look at them. And as long as you, as a UX designer, have a helpful demeanor, doing this sort of stuff doesn't look like you're intruding or forcing yourself upon the process. It tends to make everyone happy with you for embracing the process, being collaborative, and helping get all the work done. At least as I work user experience design, and many people I know agree with this, there are a lot of principles at the core of our work processes and methodologies that end up being shared with other disciplines. This crosses all kinds of areas. Service design, for example, is my latest thing that I've been investigating, where personas and audience are practically the same thing. But here, we're talking about UX integrating with development. So let's look at how these are considered by UX and development. Whereas development teams embrace the principles of reuse in an effort to find the simplest suitable solution, UX completely agrees. We have different reasons, considering holistic design and team efficiency versus optimizing for resource efficiencies such as storage, but philosophically, they're very similar. We can all conceive of componentized approaches together for more efficiency of products and processes. Good developers don't build, deliver, and then bang their heads against the wall until they forget what they just built. There's a whole philosophy of continuous improvement, both within projects and between them. Better solutions are sought, built, and installed over or added to previously built items. As UX designers, we do the same thing. We have a culture of evidence, so seek to prove success. And when we find imperfect solutions, we use that data to improve the design. Not just throw it away and start over, but take existing information and add to it. We can, again, all collaborate on improvements and conceive of new, better solutions together. In my experience, both being one and working with them, development managers assign tasks, sometimes going so far as to tear off pieces of printed documentation and give them their teams, distributing chunks of work to developers or groups of them. Processes enforce this with unit test, for example, assuring quality of that particular piece of work. UX, of course, designs holistically. Keep in mind the whole system, the whole customer experience. But no matter what we say, we understand work schedules, release plans, and defining key components first in order to understand other pieces next. Time and manpower limits all the work. We have to always keep in mind the whole structure, but admit that we can only work on one piece at a time. Developers do not, as a general rule, exist in a vacuum and don't build almost anything from scratch. Not only do they share with each other and use knowledge resources, but libraries of commonly needed items are routinely used. Think of what jQuery really is for an efficiency and reuse point of view. UX lives by the heuristic and other ways of defining known good solutions, then borrowing. Much designed with stencils, literally copying the lines or pixels from a previous design or shared library somebody has posted. Beyond modularity, we all use pattern libraries, borrow from other designs, and understand the concept of patterns. And let me take a moment to point out the fallacy of best practice that often occurs. Though it's not strictly as part of this process, it's worth mentioning. By no means is something simply commonly encountered that everybody's done before a best practice. Commonality makes it a common practice. It has to be proven to be a best solution to become a best practice. Never make assumptions or seek out information before setting it on paper or directing that it be built. So if we all agree so much in principle, and often we do, I can sit in a room with developer managers we've been arguing with and lay out this kind of argument and have them all agree that we should be able to work together. So why don't we? Practically, even after you get handshake agreements, why is it hard to get UX involved in the process? Well, because of these reasons. UX is slow. We don't understand the details of IT process. We insist on documentation when nobody really wants it. And we just don't think the way IT people do. Well, that's also all demonstrably untrue. But like I said before, you need to understand how and why in order to discuss it and make sure that you get integrated correctly. If you worked with any developers, or you are one, of course, you remember the three legs of the project. IT lives by quick, cheap, or good, and pick two. I hear it often weekly when I'm on a project, sometimes daily. There's only so much you can do about costs, unless you're a manager and accounting for budgets. And our job is about making it good, so we try to insist that that one always be the longest leg. But speed is that last fear. No one seems to want to admit they can wait an hour, much less a day or a week for a deliverable. And many developers have heard of UX when they go to conferences or read about it on forums and blogs from a very formal point of view, discussing how UCD is exercised. And it sounds like, or actually does, take months, especially when you start talking about research, though it obviously doesn't have to be. In addition to that, project processes are inefficient. Nobody admits it, but between a gleam in someone's eye and actual kickoff could be 6 months. At least in my experience, though I'm sure somebody will come back and tell me I'm deadly wrong, even in lean-like environments, in my experience, it's still something in the order of 2 months minimum. It's very easy as a UX designer, considering the system as a whole, to take that time to build features, to explore ideas and ask questions, and even draw wires up. And you can scale things. I have done good work between project kickoff and the 10 days it took to get the development team actually up to speed with all their computers installed correctly and able to access the sandbox, engaging offshore resources and mailing them things. There's always spare time, so as long as you utilize it well, you can do things by cheating the timeline, essentially. Of course, like I just said, what I did in a lot of these was scale the effort to the time, budget, and influence I have. That's not living within your means, being sad. That's collaboration and negotiation. Eventually, you can get on early, do larger projects, but at first you do what you can to prove your value. I always say any UX engagement is better than none. And lastly, quality design phases improve the deliverables. This reduces time in the back end and test and so forth. Time spent up front pays off between 8 and 20-fold to the other side. There are studies to prove this and so forth. If that's not your experience, it tends to be because someone skipped a step, didn't collaborate, ignored recommendations, or so forth. I mentioned this last because it's very difficult to bring up when you're having, when people are generally fearing things. They want the results now and not a promise of trade-off no matter how much proof there is. But if you get to that level of discussion, it's very good to pull out those studies and point it out. The next key issue is that there are cultural or process mismatches, and it'll take time to figure out how we all work together. Obviously, I've spent the first half of this deck talking about this already. The principles and processes are not that far apart. As long as everyone tries and communicates, issues tend to resolve themselves. Process and culture failures arise instead when management encourages or allows process and culture to be a problem. If everyone is reminded that the project team is the only team that exists, everything works well. Development isn't a team, testing isn't a team, design isn't a team. There's a project team. And so you should always go work off of whatever the goals for the entire project are at every step and make sure the right person engages to solve that issue. Especially in some flavors of Agile, or now the new leaning startup wannabe sort of shops, there's an ethos that documentation is an inherently bad thing. At the least, there's a fear that it conflicts with existing documents. The first two answers here already covered part of this. It doesn't take time because documentation is part of the design process, not a step afterwards. That can be an entire other discussion, and I know people who disagree with that, but it's, at least from me and most of the people I work with, part of our ethic that it's not a design if it's in your brain. It's only a design if it's on paper or a whiteboard at least. And we can scale our engagement and work with processes, as we discussed. We can make documentation in any format you want and integrate with annotation methods or styles to make it easier to build and test. And documentation is, in my experience, always used. Even in no-document shops, anything I give people on paper is used and beloved. It's photocopied and given to other people, and they send me back emails asking if they can have a digital copy. With offshoring, the fluidity of teams with people adding and removing all the time, someone will need this documented for the next release, whether that's next week or next year. The whiteboard won't be there, and they might not remember why it happened, even if they are on the team still. And lastly, always explain that UX can be flexible. We can do the work on whiteboards and by waving our arms. Doing this a little bit and cheating by taping paper documents you draw on to the whiteboards tends to help alleviate a lot of fears that you don't know how to work in their lean, collaborative, whiteboard-only environment. There's an ongoing conversation about whether designers need to code, which brings this problem into sharp focus. There are a lot of organizations that think it is required and only hire what I generally call designers/developers. Some of them are actually called that. Regardless of the name, it's a trend that is worth discussing. There's also a lot that think it's specifically bad for designers to code. We collaborate, remember? So that means specialization. Get the best person at each job and work together. By no means does any of that mean designers only know design. I find the most important job of UX, probably more than advocating for the user, more than drawing things and designing interactions, is advocating for the project. It's my ultimate answer to the should designers code question. We should know how to and know as much about every bit of technology as we can. Just like I know how furniture goes together in a factory because I did furniture design in school. I know how large printing presses work because I did graphic design. For my current jobs, I've learned about not just software, but storage and networks and location services and batteries and much more. In fact, critically for that, the argument of should designers code, much more than just HTML or C# so you can develop iOS apps. There's much more past that. So you need to think of the whole system end to end. I, in fact, think it's so important that there are somewhat giant appendices at the end of the book on topics like this. Not on development so much, but topics well outside of strict design, like location services, which are otherwise wildly complex and hard to get a basic understanding of very simply. I'll say it again, a key role of UX is to be a bridge, not just between the user or business and development, but between different development teams, such as networks and data storage and software. So what I've been starting to say we need to solve this are principles of what could be called user-centered execution. Now, this is sadly short because it's not yet a process or a series of fixed procedures or even quite a manifesto or anything that well-defined. I don't necessarily like growing a beard and living in a cabin, so it's possible it may never be that well-defined. But like the principles, heuristics, and patterns of design, the idea can be followed, and there are best practices. So to conclude this, somewhat faster than I expected, I have a few principles that I've already worked out that seem to work very well for me. It's your project, so as a designer, stick with it through the entire process. And this holds true for everyone, so make sure everyone stays involved through development, test, and implementation. As a designer, you need to be ready to stick with the project through development at least by making sure you're available for questions, rework, changes, and testing. Ideally, you become integrated in the team. If we're talking Agile, you attend the daily meetings, even if you're not someone who's been allocated project stuff. You can at least listen and answer questions. Attend test planning. Perform test if that's something that can help with. Be sure to plan on this from the start so your schedule and budgets account for it. Obviously, something that will make this all not work as a principle is if you just start doing this without asking your boss, and then they wonder where your 20 hours of your week have gone to. You may, of course, especially at first, depending on your organization, not actually be part of the implementation team, but try to become one or act like it. Go to every meeting and ask what's going on. At the very least, no matter what it is, even if you can't talk to the developers because it's some project you're doing as a vendor, you never see anybody, put your name and contact information on any documents to deliver. It works. You'll get calls from developers you've never heard of in Bangalore at 2 a.m. because they forgot about the time zone change. And you'll give them very good answers, and they'll be able to make sure the project keeps going and is built more like the way you wanted than you might expect otherwise. After you go to sleep and get up in the morning and have your coffee, you'll be happy this happened. And for developers, pick up the phone or walk over and grab the designer, even if they're not showing up themselves. If something is unclear or not specified or a new problem comes up, just ask. The designer ought to be able to come up with some solution quite fast. Assure the goals that we're working towards are for everyone. In a lot of processes, certainly the way I always like to work, you develop business and user goals, or vision statements, or whatever they're called, at the beginning of the project. And ideally, you didn't forget those. But don't just put them on the wall and keep reminding people. Your project probably has metrics. You're going to increase sales or satisfaction. Turn those goals into the metrics. Make sure the whole organization has those goals as their top drivers. Instead of cost savings, efficiency developers, lines of code built, or other internal measures only, try to tie what you're paid your bonus on even, if you can get it that far up the chain, to improvements in the project. While we're building for the end user may not resonate, remind everyone they work for the larger company, not just their department. You may also have to push to include the analytical tools to make sure they get built and you can actually measure things, which is another key part of working outside of your domain and working with other teams to make sure that their products get built. Analytics often get left behind, like test is neglected and not done enough. Analytical tools often get left behind for phase 2 or 3, but it's difficult to tell if we succeeded or if your phase-by-phase improvements are working if there's no analytics on that. I like to use object-oriented principles when discussing or delivering anything, to the point of putting them on the walls of every pod, as you can see here. The efficiencies and enforcement of consistency that componentized, object-oriented practice emphasizes in design are just as valuable to software developers and development processes. For those terminology things, where sometimes it's just called modular reuse or other things, as object-oriented is a fairly specific thing, part of a larger set of well-defined principles for development, and might confuse an implementation team that is not object-oriented per se. In fact, half the principles we care about around modularity are the same in procedural development, but I like the sound of object-oriented, and for designers it resonates and makes sense, so it's easy to talk about. The core concept is the same regardless. Instead of designing every detail for every state, annotating it, and building by state or building hundreds of items to pull together, usually a few dozen modules at most can be built, reused over and over again in common templates. And lastly, learn big words. Even if you don't annoy others with them, there's some great concepts out there. Polymorphism is a subset of the previous modularity one, but it's hard for a lot of people to get a handle on unless they have encountered it before, quite strictly, taken CS classes and so forth. Basically, if there are several variations of an on-screen module you design, make sure you express them as variations so that that relationship is clear. This is polymorphic, many variations. Of course, if there's only one variation, also called omnimorphism, then that should be explicitly stated as well, so that nobody tries to add variations or gets confused and thinks that you've done the same for that module. Always keep in mind efficiency and reuse. What makes a lot of this work for me is that it's all the same thing. I admit I came to them from different approaches, but I've come to be aware that good principles of design are the same as the principles behind communicating design to implementation teams. Develop good design objectives for the project or product. No one else's objectives will do. Design holistically for systems, not pages, not widgets, not buttons. Stick to your principles and get everyone to buy into it. And own your design all the way through so you're ready to improve it when the next release comes out. Of course, I also talk about design topics, as I said earlier, and some of this process in the book, Designing Mobile Interfaces, so we'd love you to pick up a copy. And much more usefully, be sure to visit forth.com to read it online and get updates, especially to the design and test resource lists. I get a lot of people ask questions about how to test for mobile, say, and I have a giant list of those there. And please add to the discussion if you have other information. If you missed anything, this presentation is already up on my SlideShare, as well as, of course, the fact that the entire thing with my recording will be posted in a couple days, so you can download it whenever you want. Now, I've got a fair number of questions, so give me a moment to browse those, and I'll start answering them for you. One first thing, obvious one, is I occasionally get asked what's the difference for mobile versus other development. I do a lot of projects that are across platforms or are literally multi-platform, as well as doing both strictly mobile and strictly desktop things. Strictly being a rather vague term, but I'll live with it. I'm never quite sure if there's a difference between development for different platforms. I tend to find the same principles especially apply even between web and application development. That developers are very much developers and only fairly small changes exist. And as we push for, say, documentation principles and so forth, the same principles go down quite deeply, that there is presentational code that can be knocked out when you're building JSP files in the same way that there is HTML code as presentation layer. So if anybody has a more specific question about mobile versus desktop development, I'll be happy to answer that one, but I'm not quite sure how to work that otherwise. No, my book does not contain examples of a full process for design. It hints at it, but basically it was it's basically a pattern book, so again, it goes basically to principles and so forth. and talks about some of this process like modularity and things. But if you ask enough, maybe they'll let me write a process book for them instead. Sorry for the pauses. I'm trying to read and understand some of these questions. So one that, and I won't promise to have absolutely clear answers for all these, but I'll try, and so maybe you can get something out of it. Finnet asked, what does designer perspective matter in the IT industry? The developer team might not agree with the designer's ideas. So is it just a waste of time for them to work on those, is my understanding of the question. I think that speaks to kind of that second quote that I put up there, that it's not just agreement or ideas, but that everything should be backed up by reasoning, and UX people ideally are backed up with evidence like research. And it doesn't have to be research for your project. It can be meta-research, that you've looked up something that somebody did in a formal research study and can prove it. If it's opinion, then you get down to the arguing thing, but you should never at this point in the state of the art, where we know how things work, be purely opinion-based. So designers should be allowed to bring forward their designs and only have objections to technically difficult to implement things, which are absolutely valid. If it's really hard to implement, that's a valid thing. And I don't tend to argue that. I might argue to find out why it's hard to implement, to prove that, to make sure that the next design I bring forward isn't a problem, or that there's no misunderstanding. But it's not literally arguing like, oh, well, why don't you guys just try harder? And therefore, the same way on the other side, that shouldn't be an opinion-based discussion of, but I prefer tabs over links or anything like that. It should be based on sound principles and stuff. And that's kind of the point of when I present on this, or when I push for better process integration when I'm at jobs or clients, is to try to improve the state of the industry in my tiny little way, that everybody has their job role, so it's absolutely worth pushing for everybody being allowed to do their job the best possible way. That's a good one. Lori asked, for the designers that only know the basics of, say, code storage, et cetera, where's the best place to start? I'm not sure there's a single source, a literal source for it, like read a book, take a class, because anything formal like that tends to be really time-consuming. You need to go to school and get a CS degree. And I'm not actually sure I believe in all of those anymore even. I might make enemies, but I tend to believe that some of them are becoming trade schools. They teach you how to code, not necessarily how to understand software principles. My favorite way is an extension of what I was just talking about. Talk to all of the people you're working with. Partly by talking to them, very clearly. If you have the basics, it does help. So you can ask smart questions to pursue it further. You can learn more. You can use the buzzwords they gave you to go Google it and figure out what they were talking about after you've nodded your head and pretended you knew. But also because I find, though there are common principles, though Oracle databases are used very widely and so forth, everybody implements things differently. And so, especially if you are inside, either you work very heavily with a particular client or you are inside a large enterprise organization, you kind of need to know your systems a little more than you need to know principles of, data transfer and stuff. You can start from the specifics and become aware of basically how data transfer rates are a problem. Use that on the next project, and eventually at a different organization, and start becoming learned in it. I have thought about this before because I've had teams and had to try to deal with the whole how do we educate them, and that's basically where I ended up. No one was able to give us a really good resource. Even people who on the team who were developers as well as designers and knew perfectly well. We had to do brown bags, and we did a lot of on-the-job training. So if anybody has a better idea how to learn how technical skills, we'll take it. But No, unless they ask the same question. Learning code is different. This year, for example, there's a, I can't remember what it's called, but somebody else can promote it as their question. There's a thing underway to learn how to code software. So there are a number of organizations. There may even be little events in your hometown where you don't have to just learn it online, but you could go sit in a room for 6 hours and people will teach you how to write applications. So if you're of that mindset and you're smart enough to do it and you're young enough to do it, you can absolutely learn how to write basic little apps and go home with a bouncing ball iPhone application after a few hours of work, or take online courses. Getting to very specific questions like Jason asking, when should you build a native app versus a mobile web app? Well, it's kind of a big question and not necessarily in the scope of this, but it's a fun one to answer anyway. When is the right time is the answer, obviously. It all very, very, very depends on your domain of work and the kind of information you're presenting. I tend to start anything like this, start work on any question like this by not answering it at all for the longest possible time. Do all that analytics, figure out what is really needed, draw out information architectures, and then figure out what can best meet the needs. So, for example, if you have to have lots of offsite storage, or you're having 3D fun things, or so forth. If we're disregarding things like gaming or whatever, there's some that are obviously going to be an app or something. But if you're not sure what the value is, build it out kind of sketch it out first to figure out what's needed. Analyze those technical needs and figure out what's best. If, for example, it spends a lot of time accessing database in the back end and it can't really do much as an app side, by itself, then at the very least you can start with building a mobile web version. And that's often where I ended up suggesting things. It's a good phased approach because you get lots of analytics out of that, as long as you install the analytics tools. You can find out how people are using it. You can find out what platforms they're using it on. And so even if you don't get huge numbers of people, because perhaps in your industry the expectation is mobile app, and therefore only so many people are going to discover the website, not a huge thing, but it does happen. At least for those thousands or hundreds of thousands of people who access the mobile website, you get all that data, and now you can make more informed decisions about how they would use it when you invest in an app, which platform is the most important to go on, which platforms you maybe assumed you needed because you're international are no longer needed, and so forth. Some of these are great questions, but I don't necessarily know what the point of them are, sorry. So I'm not necessarily answering all your questions. I wish you were in the room here so we could clarify. For example, somebody asked, is there some sort of widely accepted standard for UX? There are a couple of standards, bodies that have tried to wrap things around stuff. UCD ends up being kind of a standard work process for it, but is one of those that it's user-centered design, if you couldn't hear the letters I was saying and want to Google it. But it's one of those that tends to take inordinate amounts of time when it's done in the formal way, and does not also, in much the way development processes don't play nicely with others, doesn't really talk too much, in my opinion, about how to work within an organization or within an implementation process. But it's sort of the standard process by which UX is pursued. I like to stretch these and work hard on other things. See what else we got. That's my good one. Sarah asked, as a freelance designer, should we include the client in every single design process? I know we show them the final design, but is it required to have their approval in every step? I just saw a deck the other day from a management level that kind of showed this exact thing. The typical process is we talk to you and gather requirements. Then step 2 is trust us, it's okay. And step 3 is here's your design, take it or leave it. there's not just because we're nice and we think this is a good idea to get the best solution, but there's becoming an increasing belief in many industries that we need to collaborate, that you can't trust people anymore, but you need proof that they're doing the right thing, that the old ad agency model of just trust us and we'll bring you the final design isn't necessarily going to fly. So it's probably worth preparing for that from a client point of view, at least. Somebody might want to be involved very often. It's good to read this very carefully. It doesn't mean every single design decision, but in the design process as a whole, I absolutely agree with that. That you need to involve the client. You ask them questions up front and not just gather their basic idea and then run off, in their favorite other website and run off and design something, but ask them quite specific questions, much like you're doing user research. I have a standard questionnaire I ask with many of those workshop type questions that I've narrowed down enough that I can even email it or put it in SurveyMonkey. With things like what is the one purpose, if you had to pick that. What is the one type of audience as carefully defined as you can that you want to appeal to. You can ask follow-ups, but get down to these very narrow questions. And if you ask that of 3 or 4 or 5 clients, individuals on the client side individually, you end up with rather good results that you wouldn't get otherwise. And you can end up defining the project a lot better than you might also. Likewise, I'm asked a lot of times, what's your deliverable? And my first answer is it doesn't matter. Though I end up building this UI spec that you'd call a wireframe, it's not like I finish that questionnaire and then go off and 3 months later you get a UI spec. You get all the responses to these words narrowed down into problem statements. Then you get a list of prospective features, kind of goals that we need. Then you get a high-level diagram of how it's going to be laid out and so forth. And at each step, everybody understands why that step, what that document says, and how we arrived at it from the previous step. And that's involvement, and it tends to make people happy. Plus, you can bill them for the meetings. Oh, darn, you just asked for my good example of a client questionnaire. I actually have one that I'd probably be willing to share if somebody reminds me over, you can see all my contact information on the screen. Somebody can send me an email or Twitter it or something, and I'll try to get it posted or something. I have one that I actually put out in my previous little self-published book, but I can probably share it with you if you email it to me, and I'll just send you the questions. I'm not going to take the time to read it to you, though I could. It's kind of boring. But absolutely, it's one of those, like a lot of these, where I haven't just dreamed it up, but I've used it on 50 or 70 projects and narrowed it down to be really good. It works based on experience. So, and as you can tell, since I keep writing stuff and publishing things, I don't mind sharing stuff. It's not part of my secret sauce. We need to improve the community. So anytime that that I tell you that I have something, ask me, and if I can, I'll share it with you. What's the best resources, it says, to start with mobile UX from web UX? Assuming what you mean is you're a web designer and you want to get into mobile. Resource-wise, for starters, grab a couple books, like mine. To a certain degree, we wrote it for that way, that you're used to technology, but you need to get it. You need to change your mindset to mobile point of view. There's a number of other, all the typical principles for the typical books. I don't know why I kept saying principles that come up when you do, say, an Amazon search on mobile stuff are pretty good. And you just need to get the mindset around it as more than anything. You start, especially if you're willing to start, you go to mobile website development from doing desktop web, you can ease your way into it quite easily by simply understanding some of the key things that, not that it's a small screen, but that it's a distracting screen, that you carry it around all the time, that it has, the connectivity might be wonky, that you can get glare that people don't really care about all the time and use it to fill in the spaces, that text entry is difficult, so don't throw away any entry, and don't make them type too much, that it has sensors. So instead of asking them where they are, you can ask the device where they are. Once you get used to mobile web development, you can start moving on to the next phase of things. I keep getting questions, so I have to press refresh and wait for it to come up. Try to work this. This sounds similar to one I've just been solving lately that Sarah asked another question. If a mobile app has some complaints from users that a button is placed in the wrong area, are there design suggestions and concerns? What do we do to address those is, I think, what the point of the question is. I tend to say these are the same as any research findings. Even if they're individual complaints, like you get a feedback form versus you actually ran research and these are the results of it, you can't do anything based on an individual complaint, and you almost never take the advice, like, I want this to be blue or I want this at the bottom of the page, whether it comes from an executive or somebody else on the team or from a user. What you need to get to is what the problem is, and then look for the best solution to that problem. I've used a lot of feedback like this, like I expected this button to be over here, and then we didn't end up doing that solution, but it pointed to a problem with something. An example of how to define what the problem is, though, is you need to get back to heuristics a lot of times. What is the expectation of the end user? So the reason I pulled this up is it said button. I've been dealing a lot with button misplacement lately. And so it's kind of a good example that group I'm working with is building, and maybe going to launch an iOS app and an Android app. And they both look basically exactly the same. And because they can't look the same, because there are differences in the app frameworks, and because the users have different expectations, the Android users tested had a hugely difficult time finding the buttons up in the top bar. There's a back button at the top bar and kind of a submit button for the form, because they're not used to finding them there, and they didn't really stick out. They're not rendered the same way. There's no particular problem with them there in iOS, the iPhone or so forth, but it was terrible in Android. And so that's one of those that I came in and pointed out even before the test, this is going to be a problem, because though it seemed fine from a general design point of view, it seemed fine on a wireframe before you did graphic design, and it seemed fine when you tested the iPhone one. When you switch to different app platform, it didn't work. And these are, those are the kind of thing you need to have just an understanding, drill into why everything is where it is when you do those heuristic evaluations. It isn't just what sticks out at you because it's what you're expecting. It's what you evaluate every item and figure out why it's a problem. Obviously, surveys and research make it easier. You don't have to look at every item and blink your eyes a lot to try to make sure you're not missing anything. You can look at the items they point out to you are a problem and figure out why they're a problem. Just a moment, I'm going to look up something for somebody to make sure. So the question I'm trying to figure out exactly is, Dr. Hetrick asked, what about WCAG as an interface model? And that's a Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the W3C Accessibility Initiative. I have never really thought about using those. I'm not actually sure necessarily what interface model means. So I'd love to see more question on that if there's time to type a new one, type more explanation, or just email me what you mean and I'll think about it. Refresh, maybe this is it. Oh, somebody else's. But almost every time I put a presentation of any sort out, somebody says, I'm surprised you didn't talk about accessibility or something, and I should probably start putting it in there as a bullet point and like the disclaimer. In the same way I should probably put my disclaimer about, yes, I'm mobile, but on the other hand, I consider all development the same. I do strictly adhere to accessibility principles during any of my design, but it's one of those, like a lot of my process principle things, where I almost don't think about it when I'm doing it. I don't have to have a page that says this is how we will address accessibility. Though for technical purposes, when building features, there's often a story, let's say, that says accessibility compliance will be the following, to make sure the developers don't miss it. The reason is that it's one of those, when you bake the principles down the right way, that you build your markup the right way, and it's inherently semantic and it makes sense. And this falls naturally from designing your processes. I'm not quite saying that right. You're designing your design the right way, that you don't start building it the way that it finally looks. You start building it with feature sets. Then you add in, okay, we're going to have probably what's called an interface, and it's going to have the following information in the following order, and it has the following hierarchy. And you can see if you use that principled high-level design to build the page markup or the presentational code, then you've got that semantic layout, whether it's web or anything else, that you use that to help define data structures so that information is stored in databases in ways that are sensible, so that even in some other project that uses a database that had no idea how the interface should work is at least halfway towards having the data loaded in a sensible manner. So yeah, I often don't officially look into accessibility in the sense of, and now we will do the accessibility review, but and therefore I have never looked at WCAG as a principle of design, though I'll try to now. But it's another one of those where it absolutely has to be considered, not just because it's important for the safety of the world, but because the principles are absolutely in line with everything else we should be doing. So Warner asks, I'm starting as a UX UI web designer at a company that mainly focuses on back-end database projects. I was thinking about setting up some meetings with the developers to teach them some ideas about the UX and design process. Good idea or waste of time? If they'll accept the meetings, then it's almost certainly a good idea, because that means they're ready to listen to you, and that's great. Yeah, obviously, since I just did this presentation on it, I would tend to say that you need to talk to them in their way. Try to find out, preferably before the meeting, how their process works, how they expect you to work, assuming that you're the first UX guy. Obviously, if there is a team there, then find out how they integrate with design already. And try to maybe corner a friendly developer to find out what they think design is. Now, a lot of times they have fairly significant misunderstandings, so you can just do that kind of very friendly, you think we're this, but we can do so much more, and we can do it with you. I've very rarely been able to do that formal stand-up with a group and present why we have value. It's always been much more messing with the politics and persuading people and nudging my way in. But occasionally, and then usually, much deeper into it, they go, yay, we're using it all the time, but why are we using it? Then I have to explain it with this setting. If up front, it would be great. And that's about all I have to say. It's a great thing to do. So if you have the opportunity to do so, talk to your developers, absolutely. And I've been answering them in a random order, so now I'm going to scan through and make sure there's nothing else, since we are coming up on just a few minutes to the end. I'm not sure. So David Drucker asked, doesn't mobile have different use cases? I assume this is in response to my mobile, desktop, software, back-end, front-end, middleware, whatever. It's all the same thing. He asked, doesn't mobile have different use cases than developers may not understand? They may be replicating the use cases from desktop that don't apply in mobile user populations. To one definition of use case, true, but one of those things where I'm a pain in the ass to people is that I reject that version of use case. It's often too detailed, and this is one of the reasons that I like to get up there and help write business requirements, what I tend to call from the old days business requirements, and then help guide the functional requirements, to keep everything at that first level, high enough level and generic enough. To me, use cases are about the user, how they're going to use the system, and they've turned into kind of data management functional requirements over time to the point where they overly involve the system. So to me, even if you can't change that method, because often the use case thing is very baked into, like they bought technical systems and everybody shares them over data stores and stuff. And so that, you may not be able to change that system, but you can probably often at least do something like link those to higher level objectives and goals or information architectures. And I guess see my tagline here on the last thing, the design for every screen, which is another presentation I have. It brings it back to that level, that the core design that at least I think you should be pushing is agnostic. And so, yeah, then it starts getting to a much deeper discussion. I want to make sure that I get this one last question. Big discussion. Yeah, one last one, I think. And then Yasmina can interrupt me whenever she wants to for us being out of time. Rui asked, why be specific on duties? Isn't it good to have UX/dev people? I assume this is that discussion of designer developers or the generalist being a good thing. It is an opinion. There are organizations that do good work with generalists. Some of my best friends are designer developers. Literally, I mean, I got some of the quotes for this thing on them. Actually, that second to last slide, the guy facing away from you is one of the developers. Guys I know works at Garmin, which is one of those combined, has almost no pure UX people. I think that there is no such thing. There are lots of things, but one of the things that as I think about this more, I've decided is true, is that there's no such thing as a sufficiently generalist. That you end up with, say, HTML/web designer, UX guys at best, and that there's some other problems, like it's hard to be good at both jobs, really be baked into it. You tend to end up spending all your time being a developer, and so you constrain your designs to what you know how to develop. You miss out on design trends that are outside of clever implementation solutions, but you also end up still having to collaborate with middleware guys or data store guys, or you don't, and you build flat files when you should actually be collaborating with somebody else. So I am personally the assembly line person. Even if you're all collaborative and it's not going down the line, it's not waterfall, right? It's all agile. I like specialization because there's so many specialties that I always want to get the best solution possible, and so find the specialist whenever I can. I'm sure there are times when I disagree, and I've absolutely hired people who were more generalist. When you get a small enough shop, sometimes there's no way around it and stuff. But my preference is definitely collaboration with specialists. Anyway, unless my clock is off, I think we're out of time now.